how does one how does one feel at peace in this society when your identity or like your success uh, in that society is fundamentally tied to your utility, and
Mm.
oftentimes maximizing your utility, as you talk about in your book as well, is just like fundamentally impossible. So it's the uh, it's that in and of itself is quite alienating.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. And that's the kind of and that's where I'm trying to get with the idea of utilitarianism and extending it beyond, say, the experience of students, is that I the more and more you kind of examine kind of contemporary society, you realize that so many of us are engaged in activities that economists would describe as maximizing our utility. So we're kind of at a point where so many people are kind of working longer than ever beyond the hours that they're actually paid for. So many people are trying to learn new skills, get an education, so on and so forth, getting into debt and doing so. And as they keep doing this, it seems like our kind of the collective, the common good is kind of dismantled at the same time by kind of neoliberal capitalism. And part of the trajectory that I try to map in the book is from this idea of what we call utilitarianism, which many people I'm sure have heard of. And I don't want to necessarily delve into the kind of boring political economy history of utilitarianism, but the
I was
base
planning
of
on it. I was planning on it.
oh,
So,
great,
yeah.
great, we can fill our books with Jeremy Bentham and the like.
Yes, exactly.
Um, yeah, but the basic premise of utilitarianism is that if each individual maximizes their utility, then it'll lead to the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. It's a kind of majoritarian ethics. And there's deep problems with that idea, which I can identify in the book. But what I argue is that with neoliberalism, we have flipped into a form of utilitarianism, where individuals, as individuals, maximize their own individual utility. It actually leads to the active deconstructing of the common good, of the greatest happiness. So it leads ultimately to the greatest unhappiness of the greatest number of people. And yet we are completely trapped in this scenario, that we have no other choice than to try and maximize our utility. But in doing so, it actively works against our kind of common good. And a few individuals will rise to the top, a few individuals will maximize their utility and benefit from it. But the vast majority of people won't, and they'll get trapped in debt, in the inability to live kind of valuable and enjoyable lives.
Yeah, and I remember studying. Well, let's talk about Jeremy Bentham, right? Who
Mm.
you kind of trace as the founder, the intellectual, genesis behind utilitarianism. And I remember reading him in college, and the fixation on pain and pleasure as this binary, where that rules all human beings. You flesh this out as well, but it creates a very perverse set of incentives if you're going to structure your society around that binary. Can you talk a bit about what his theory about the world is and how it birthed utilitarianism, which, as you
Yeah,
trace, eventually does branch, and one of the branches is neoliberalism.
yeah. So yeah, Bentham, a kind of strange kind of figure, strange kind of thinker. Marx was extremely critical of him. He called him a deeply English phenomenon and uh, a kind of very limited thinker. But his basic premise was, so he identified utility, as you say, as the kind of should be the kind of goal of each individual, and he saw utility basically as pursuing, in every decision you make, pursuing the thing that gives you pleasure over pain. And the most ethical decision was the one that produced the most pleasure against pain over a kind of long period. Um, and it's interesting for that for him, he could never quite define how we go about measuring utility, and partly because the idea he tried to he thought about utility as if it was some sort of objective phenomenon, some sort of natural concept that kind of existed in the world, and that actually the things that are constructed as useful or pleasurable and so on and so forth are actually deeply implicated in kind of social structures in which we live, and often governed by the kind of ruling classes who determine what is the most useful course of action for the kind of wider society. They never acknowledged that.
Yeah. And sorry to interrupt, but like the contradiction of pleasure being able to exist in a vacuum, as opposed to at the expense or at the creation of pain of others, which is just like that's exploitation, and that's foundational to the world.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the kind of ideas of pleasure that people like Bentham and future utilitarian thinkers put forward are very much kind of Western ideas of pleasure. And it's interesting that for Bentham, he tries to come up with kind of examples of how we measure utility. At one point, he thinks about measuring pulse rate, and then he kind of abandons the idea, and eventually he settles on money as the measurement of utility. And he says something like the barometer is the measurement of air pressure, the thermometer is the measurement of temperature, money is the measurement of utility. So it's obvious here how this overlaps with kind of capitalist accumulation, capital accumulation. And basically he's saying that on the thing that we must pursue on an individual level is utility, and if utility is money, then the thing we must pursue is money. Then we must accumulate as much money as possible on an individual level. And this, of course, kind of is attractive to kind of classical economists and neoclassical economists in the 19th century, and then into the 20th century, the kind of neoliberal thinkers take on a kind of form of utilitarianism that eventually develops into the kind of capitalism that we experience today. But this link between utility and money is deeply is at the heart of utilitarian thinking. And utilitarian thinking has a major impact on the development of economic science over the kind of 19th and 20th century.